Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The Sacks arrived at 7. Edmund was at his desk by 6:30, which gave him a full hour before the Sacks came in and the day properly began. An hour he used not for the work that would be required of him, but for the work he required of himself, which was a different kind of work entirely, and which he had conducted in this manner, in this chair, at this desk, in the corner of the long room, for the better part of 35 years. The office at 6:30 was a different place from the office at 8. At 8, it was a working room. Voices, movement, the thump and slide of letters being sorted along the oak tables, the particular rhythm of the office in full operation. At 6:30, it was only itself. The long oak tables empty and gleaming in the gaslight, the pigeonholes on the south wall holding the previous day's residue in their labelled slots, the windows on the north side showing the January sky in its earliest grey, the coal fire already lit by the cleaner, who came at 6 and left before Edmund arrived, and whose name he had known for many years, and whose face he associated entirely with the smell of coal smoke and the sight of a swept grate. He sat at his desk and opened the drawer on the left side and took out the letter he had been composing yesterday evening, which was not finished. He had reached the point where he needed to say something true about a situation he did not fully know, which was the point at which most of his letters required the most care, and which was why he had set it aside and returned to it with a fresh morning rather than finishing it at the desk yesterday. He read it from the beginning. Then he continued. The letter was to a woman in Cork, or rather, the original letter, the one in the dead letter office's sack, had been from a woman in Cork addressed to her sister in Limerick, and had been returned because the sister had died in November and the letter had found no one at the address it was given. It was a Christmas letter. It spoke of the children, of the price of butter, of a neighbour's illness, of the hope that the crossing would be quiet and the visit pleasant. It had not yet learned that the visit would not happen, because the person who could have told it had already gone. Edmund had read it 3 weeks ago. He had set it in his left-hand drawer. He had thought about it on the train home, and on the train in, and during the evenings in his rooms in Clerkenwell, and he had decided, as he sometimes did, that something should be written back. Not as the sister. He never wrote as the intended recipient. He wrote as himself, as E. Fitch, Clerk, GPO, and he wrote briefly and carefully, in the manner of a man who understood the limits of what a stranger could offer and worked within them, that her letter had been received and read, that it had reached the office in good order, that the news of her sister's passing had come to him through the returned address, and he was sorry for it, and that her letter had found a reader, if not the one she intended. He signed it E. Fitch, and paid the postage himself, and put it with the Morning Post. The Sacks arrived at 7, brought up from the sorting floor by two men with a trolley, and the morning shifted. Edmund put the finished letter in his coat pocket. It would go out with the 10 o'clock post, and cleared his desk of the drawer's contents, and became, in the transition that happened each morning at this hour, the senior clerk of the dead letter office, rather than the man who came in early to do his own work at the public's expense of paper. The sacks were opened at the long oak tables. There were 3 of them this Monday morning, lighter than Friday's, which always came heavy with the week's accumulation, but substantial enough. Letters from across London and beyond, from the home counties, from the Midlands, from Scotland, from Ireland, from addresses in England written from addresses abroad. All of them returned. All of them failed, in the specific technical sense that the post office used the word. They had failed to reach their destinations and had returned here to be opened, inventoried, assessed, and either returned to the sender, held for collection, or, if unclaimed after the statutory period, destroyed. Edmund stood at the head of the centre table and watched the morning's work begin with the particular attention of a man who had watched it begin every morning for 35 years, and who found that it still required his full attention, because no 2 sacks were the same, and the work of assessing each letter for what could be done with it was work that could not be done carelessly. The work of the dead letter office was, as Edmund had always understood it, the work of last resort. Every letter that arrived here had been, before it arrived here, somewhere else, had been sorted at a local office, carried by a postman, perhaps attempted at a door and found no answer, perhaps returned because the street did not exist, or the number was wrong, or the name was spelled in a way no one could reconcile with anyone on the actual street. Some had been opened at other offices to look for a return address. Some came with notes from other clerks. No such street. Addressee removed. Deceased. Some came with no note at all, only the silence of having been sent and having found nothing. The dead letter office was where they came when every other avenue had been tried. This was the thing that Edmund had felt on his first day in 1858, and which he still felt on this Monday morning in January of 1893, as not quite a weight and not quite a privilege, but something between the two. These letters were not waste. They were not failures in the way that a broken tool was a failure. They were simply letters that had not yet found what they were looking for, and they had been sent here as a last possibility, because even the General Post Office, in its Victorian thoroughness, did not simply discard the things that had not yet found their place. He had developed, over 35 years, a particular way of reading the direction on a letter before opening it, a habit of a few seconds of full attention to the outside before the inside was known. The direction told you a great deal if you had learned to read directions the way the dead letter office taught you to. The confidence or hesitation in the handwriting, the condition of the envelope, whether the sender had known the postcode or guessed it, whether the address had been written all at once or added in stages as though the sender had paused between street and district and city, uncertain whether to continue. These things did not change the category, but they helped him understand what he was holding before he held it open. He picked up the first letter of the morning and read the direction. By 9 o'clock, the morning sacks had been divided into their categories. There was a system. There had always been a system refined over the decades by Edmund and his predecessors into a document of some precision that had been read by almost no one outside the office, and that Edmund had come to regard as one of the more elegant pieces of administrative writing he had encountered in a career spent among administrative documents. The categories were straightforward: returnable to sender, address present and legible, return postage affixable, holdable for collection, sender unknown but addressee locatable in the register, opened for sender identification, no exterior return address, and the final category, which had various official names over the years and which Edmund thought of simply as held, because it contained letters for which no action was possible, which had come from nowhere identifiable and gone nowhere findable, and which would be kept for 30 days and then destroyed. It was the held letters that he kept in his drawer. This was not the procedure, and never had been. The procedure was to inventory all categories and process them according to their disposition, which for held letters meant 30 days in the office's holding boxes and then destruction. He had arrived at his own arrangement gradually, over the first months of his time in the office, as he had read through the held letters during the inventory and found again and again that some of them required a longer consideration than the inventory gave them. He had simply begun keeping those ones at his desk until the consideration was complete. He had never been formally authorized to do this until Partridge entered it in the log in 1862. Before 1862, it had been an unauthorized practice that no one had noticed or questioned. After 1862, it was an authorized one that no one noticed or questioned. The difference was principally internal. Not all of them, not most of them, only the ones that he read in the course of the necessary opening and inventorying, and which stayed with him in the particular way that certain letters did, which was not a way he had ever been able to specify, only to recognize. He had a drawer full. He had always had a drawer full. He ate his mid-morning bread at his desk, as he always did, because the mid-morning break was 10 minutes, and the eating of bread took approximately 4 minutes, and the remaining 6 were better spent reading than standing in the corridor. The letter he read during the 6 minutes was from a boy. He could tell by the handwriting, large, irregular, the letters formed with the concentration of someone who had not long been writing them, the capitals slightly taller than the lines required. It was addressed to Father Christmas at the North Pole. It had been posted in December and had arrived here in the first week of January, which was not unusual. They received several such letters each year and had a standing procedure. They were inventoried and held, and, at the end of the statutory period, destroyed, because there was no sender address, and no addressee address, and no action that could be taken. Edmund had held this one in his drawer since the first week of January. The letter asked for a wooden horse, for a pair of warm stockings for his mother, and for his father to come home from wherever he had gone, if Father Christmas could manage it. It was signed, "Your friend, William," with a cross beneath it that might have been a kiss, or might have been how William thought letters ended. Edmund set it down. He finished his bread. He sat for a moment. He picked up his pen. He wrote to William. He wrote as himself, E. Fitch, clerk, which was his rule, always, and he noted that William's letter had been received and read with full attention. He said that the wooden horse had been noted. He said that he hoped William's mother was warm. He said that he could not speak to William's father's whereabouts, as that fell outside the office's remit, but that he hoped William might have news of him in due course. He did not lie. He never lied in these letters. He did not claim to be Father Christmas or a representative of Father Christmas or anyone other than what he was, a clerk who had read a letter and who felt, after reading it, that something ought to be written back. He addressed it to William, care of the return address printed on the envelope, a lodging house in Bethnal Green, which suggested that William had posted it himself or had found someone to post it, because children who lived in lodging houses in Bethnal Green did not generally have adults to help them with their correspondence. He sealed it and put it in his coat pocket with the cork letter and paid the postage as usual from the small leather purse he kept in his waistcoat pocket for this purpose. He had calculated once what he spent on postage in an average year. It was a figure that would not have alarmed most people, and that would have alarmed a few, depending on their view of what a clerk's private obligations should amount to. He had not written the number down. He had put it in the same place where he put other things that did not require to be written down, the category that contained, among other things, the number of letters answered before 1874, the content of the Brighton man's reply, and the expression on Partridge's face when he said it keeps the work honest, and went back to the log. These were things he carried rather than recorded. The ledger was for counting. The other category was for keeping. Arthur Blunt had been at the dead letter office for 6 years, which made him, in Edmund's estimation, still a newcomer in the deepest sense, still in the period where the work was something he did rather than something he was, though he was 6 years past the point at which most newcomers either left or began to feel themselves established. He was 34, capable, occasionally impatient with the pace of the work in the way of men who have not yet understood that the pace of the work is itself the work. He was also, which Edmund had come to appreciate over the 6 years, observant in the particular way of someone who notices what is present rather than what is expected to be present, a useful quality in any office, and more useful than usual in this one. He arrived at his table at 8 each morning, and he worked steadily and accurately and asked questions when he had them, which was the right approach. He had noticed Edmund's early mornings, had mentioned once in his first year that the senior clerk seemed to come in remarkably early, and had accepted Edmund's explanation that he found the office quieter before 7, without appearing entirely satisfied. He had said nothing more about it for 2 years. In the 3rd year, he had said, "You post letters yourself, I think." Edmund had looked up from the table. "Occasionally," in reply to the ones from the drawer. "Yes." Arthur Blunt had considered this. "That's irregular," he said. "Yes," said Edmund. "Is it permitted?" Edmund had thought about this carefully when he first began the practice in the late 1850s, and had reached the conclusion that it was not prohibited, which was not precisely the same as being permitted, but was sufficient for his purposes. "I believe so," he said. Arthur Blunt had continued to observe, which Edmund had expected. Observation was, after all, the core skill of the office. They were all, in their different ways, practiced at reading what a letter contained and what it implied, and what could be done about the distance between the two. What he had observed over the years was the drawers cycle. Letters went in, and, after a period, Edmund could not have specified consistently because it varied with each letter. Letters came out, at which point Edmund would spend a portion of his early morning writing something and a portion of his break or his lunch sealing it and adding it to his coat pocket, from which it disappeared by afternoon. He had asked, eventually, what Edmund wrote in reply to letters that had been sent to dead people and the wrong addresses and Father Christmas. Edmund had told him what was true. "What is true," said Arthur Blunt, "that I have read the letter, that it has been received, that the office received it in good order. Where the situation is known, where I know from the address records that the intended recipient has died, for instance, I include that, briefly. Where there are children involved, I am careful. You write to the senders. When I can, when I know who they are. And when you don't." Edmund had looked at him for a moment. "Then I write to the letter," he said. Arthur Blunt had considered this for some time and hadn't asked any further questions, which Edmund took as a form of acceptance, though he was aware that acceptance and understanding were not the same thing, and that Arthur Blunt might have accepted the practice without understanding it, which was a reasonable position for a man 6 years into the office. Understanding it fully, Edmund had found, required more than 6 years. It had required for him approximately 20 years, and he was not certain he had finished. The afternoon brought the second delivery, 2 more sacks, smaller than the morning's. Arthur Blunt and the 2 junior clerks processed them at the tables, while Edmund returned to his desk and worked through the registration, the statutory log that the office kept of every letter received, and its disposition, which was required and which Edmund had maintained with meticulous accuracy for 35 years, and which would, he was aware, be maintained with equal accuracy by whoever succeeded him, because the requirement did not change, and the accuracy was not his personal addition to it, but the only appropriate standard for the work. He was careful about this distinction. He was careful always about what was required and what was his own. The registration was required. The early mornings were his own. The drawer was his own. The letters he replied to and the postage he paid were his own. The cost of the postage, which he had calculated and not written down, was his own. This clarity had seemed important to him from the beginning, because he had always understood that the office's procedures and his own were not the same procedures and should not be confused with each other, even though they occupied the same room and were carried out by the same pair of hands. He entered the afternoon's receipts into the log with the same care he gave to the morning's. Outside, through the high north windows, the January sky had not changed since morning. It was the same flat pale grey it had been at 7, uniform and low, the particular sky of London in January that gave no indication of the sun's position and no promise of change before dark. He had watched this sky through these windows for 35 winters. It was not a sky that encouraged the view that anything in particular was happening above it. It was simply winter's sky, which was perhaps the right sky for an office whose work was the mail that had not arrived. There was a letter in the afternoon sack that he set aside. It was addressed in a careful adult hand to my husband, wherever he is now. No street, no town, no name other than the possessive, my husband, as though she had decided that was sufficient to find him, and the world was simply obliged to agree. The postmark said Sheffield, which was where she had posted it. The envelope was good quality paper, well sealed, the direction written slowly and with intent. Someone had taken care with the outside of this letter. He opened it with the paper knife, as he opened all the letters in the inventory, and read what was required to establish the category. He read rather more than was required. He set it in his drawer, and closed the drawer, and did not think about it for the rest of the afternoon, which was a skill he had developed of necessity over many years, and which was, he thought, one of the more underestimated skills the office required of anyone who did the work properly: the ability to put something in a drawer and leave it there, not suppressing it, not forgetting it, only setting it aside in the specific and deliberate way of a person who knows they will return to it when they are ready, was the skill that made the early mornings possible. Without it, the letters would have followed him home every evening, and the early mornings would have been too full of accumulated urgency to do the work they needed to do. Letters that went in the drawer stayed in the drawer until he was ready to think about them properly. And thinking about them properly required the early morning and the quiet and the absence of the day's other demands. He was ready for some letters sooner than others. This one, he thought, would take a while. Arthur Blunt put on his coat at 5 and stopped at Edmund's desk on his way out. "The husband letter," he said. Edmund looked up. "I saw the direction when it came through," Arthur Blunt said. "Are you going to answer it?" Edmund considered. "I don't know yet," he said. Arthur Blunt looked at him with the expression he had developed over 6 years, which was the expression of a man who had decided that his senior colleague's private occupation was not exactly his business, but was not exactly not his business either. "Do you always know what to say?" he said. Edmund thought about this. He had been asked it before, in different words, by different people. Not many people, perhaps 3 or 4 over the years, because not many people knew what he did. He had given different answers on different occasions, according to the person. To Arthur Blunt, he said, "No, but I generally know whether to say anything." Arthur Blunt nodded, as though this were a satisfactory answer, which perhaps it was. He said good night and went out, and Edmund listened to his footsteps descend the stairs. And then there was only the sound of the office settling, which was what Edmund had been waiting for since 7 in the morning. He opened the drawer. He reread the Sheffield letter in full. She had written it, she explained in the first paragraph, because she could not think where else to send it, and she had a great deal to say, and the practice of saying it, even to a letter she did not expect to reach anyone, seemed better than not saying it. Her husband had left in the spring of 1891. He had not sent word of where he had gone or why. She had inquiries made through her brother, and the inquiries had established that he had left his place of employment in Sheffield and had not appeared at his mother's house in Doncaster, and had taken his better coat and his boots, and, as far as she could tell, nothing else. She was not angry, she wrote. Or she was, but that was not the primary thing. The primary thing was that she had lived with him for 11 years, and she wanted to know what she had done wrong. And since she could not ask him, she was writing it down, because writing it down was, she had found, sometimes as good as asking. She had written 3 pages. The question repeated itself, in different forms, throughout. What was it? What was wrong? What had she failed to see? Edmund read it through once. Then he put it in the drawer, because he was not ready yet. He put on his coat and went home to Clerkenwell. He walked to the Underground at St. Paul's, rather than taking the omnibus. The walk was 20 minutes in January cold, and he took it most evenings, because the evenings that he spent at the office until 6 or later were the evenings when he needed the 20 minutes before arriving home. It was a habit of regulation, the same kind as the early mornings, the same kind as the drawer, things he did to give the other things their proper time. The city in January at 6 in the evening was its own world, the gas lamps already lit, the pavements wet from the day's brief sleet, the street sellers gone or going, the offices emptying their populations into the cold. He walked with his coat buttoned to the collar and his hands in his pockets. In his waistcoat pocket, the purse for postage. In his right, the 2 letters he had written this morning, and which would go out with the post tomorrow, because the 10 o'clock had already gone. The Cork woman, William, in Bethnal Green. He thought about them as he walked, the 2 letters in his right coat pocket, acquiring a slight additional weight in his awareness. Not guilt, nothing like guilt, only the presence of an obligation that was pleasant to carry and would be discharged tomorrow. Not extensively. He did not allow himself to think extensively about the people behind the letters until he was ready to write, because extensive thought without the discipline of writing was a kind of indulgence that the letters did not require and which served only himself. But he thought about them briefly, the way you carry something briefly before you set it down, just long enough to know what you are carrying. He descended at St. Paul's. The train was warm and very loud and full of the evening's population moving from one part of the city to another with the purposeful anonymity of people who have decided not to look at each other. He found this restful, usually. He was a man who had spent his working life reading other people's private writing and the anonymity of a crowded underground train. Everyone sealed in their own silence, their own movement, their own private purpose, was a form of relief he had come to appreciate. No one on the underground was asking to be read. They were only going somewhere. He had been keeping count since 1874, when he had begun to wonder and had started a ledger. The ledger was at home, in his rooms in Clerkenwell, in the second drawer of the writing desk he had bought in 1869 from a furniture maker in Gray's Inn Road, a desk that was well made and that he had always found suited to the work he did at it. He kept the ledger because the counting had seemed important once he began to count, not for any practical purpose, only because precision was a habit that extended in him to things that did not require it as well as things that did. Since 1874, when he began the count, he had answered 214 letters. He had estimated, from memory and the records he kept at the office, that in the years before 1874, the 16 years from 1858, when he began, to 1874, He had answered perhaps 150 more, which gave a total, by January of 1893, of somewhere in the range of 360 to 370 letters answered over 35 years of early mornings and mid-morning bread and the occasional late evening in the empty office. He had received fewer replies than he might have expected, perhaps a dozen in 35 years, from people who had found their way to Fitch at the GPO and had decided, for their own reasons, to write back. Each one had surprised him. He had not written his practice for the purpose of being thanked, and the replies that came were not always thanks. The Manchester mother had told him clearly that he was wrong, and he had kept that reply also. He had made quiet arrangement for such letters years ago, noting with the postal clerk that anything addressed to Fitch at the dead letter office should come to him directly rather than through the general sort. There were categories of letters that he did not answer. He had worked these out over time, by trial and error in the early years, and by something closer to settled principle later, and he had come to trust his own sense of when a reply would help and when it would not, and when it would make something worse than silence. He did not answer letters that had been intended as private in a way that would be violated by a stranger's knowledge of their contents. Some letters, he knew this from having read thousands of them in the course of his work, were private in a way that was not reduced by their undeliverability. They had been private when sent, and they remained private, and the fact of their having arrived at the dead letter office did not make them available to be answered. He read them for the inventory, because the inventory required it, and he placed them in their category and left them. He did not answer letters that asked for things he could not honestly address, letters that asked for money or asked for news he did not have, or asked questions whose answers he could only guess at, and guessing would be worse than saying nothing. He did not answer letters that were not meant to be received. There was a category of letter, small, specific, uncommon, that had been sent not because the sender expected a reply, but because the sender needed to send. A letter to the dead, or to someone who had left and left no address. These were different from other letters. These he read and returned to their place and did not reply to, because a reply would have missed the point of the sending. He had broken this rule 4 times in 35 years and had not, in any of the 4 cases, been glad he had broken it. The rule existed because he had needed it to exist. Because without a rule about when not to write, he would have written to everyone, which would have been wrong, not because of the expense or the effort, but because not everyone who sends a letter needs a reply from a stranger. Some letters need only to be sent. The office's job was to receive them. His job was to know which ones needed something more. There was a letter from the previous November that had taken him until January to answer. It was from an elderly man in Bristol who had written to his daughter in Bristol, a short distance, a letter that should have arrived the next morning, that had instead been returned because the address did not exist. Not the street existed, but the number. There was no 37 Collier Lane, Bristol, because Collier Lane had only 19 houses. The man had written to an address his daughter had given him, which was not the address where she lived. Edmund had looked up the Bristol records. He had found no Collier Lane in the electoral roll at 37. He had found the name given in the direction Miss M. Harrington at no address in Collier Lane at all, which meant she was either not registered or had never lived there. The letter was 3 pages of a father to a daughter who had not been where she said she was. He had held it for 8 weeks. In the end, he had written to the father in Bristol at the return address. He had said that the letter had not reached its destination and that the office had been unable to locate the intended recipient at the address given. He had said it carefully, without implication, because implication was not his business. He had said that the father's letter had been read and set aside with care, and that he was sorry it had not found its way. He had not said what the record showed. The letters to fictional addresses interested him particularly, not because they were more unusual than the others. They were not, statistically. Several arrived each week, addressed to places that did not exist with a specificity that suggested the sender knew this perfectly well, but because of what the specificity revealed. A letter addressed to a fictional street in a real city, in a real postcode, with a real name above the door. This was someone who had thought carefully about where they were sending the letter and had decided deliberately that it should go nowhere real. He had a theory about these letters, which he had refined over many years of reading them and testing the theory against the evidence, as one tests any theory that is not susceptible to experimental verification. The theory was, they were not mistakes. They were not letters intended for a real address that had gone wrong at the direction writing stage. They were letters written to the idea of a recipient rather than a recipient. Letters whose sender had needed to write them, but had not been able to address them to a real person because the real person was not available or was gone or had never existed in the form required. He handled these with particular care. He usually did not reply to them because a reply from a stranger would have contradicted their purpose, which was to be sent and not received. But he read them, as he read all letters that required it, and he held them for their 30 days, and sometimes, in the early mornings, he wrote a few lines to no one in particular that were not a reply and not a letter, but something in between, which he kept in a separate part of the drawer and which he had never sent. He wrote to William in Bethnal Green for the 2nd time in February. The first letter had been the January reply, the careful, factual clerk's letter. The second was different. He had received, in the last week of January, a return letter from Bethnal Green, not the same address, 2 streets away, addressed in a child's hand to Mr. Fitch at the Post Office, London. It had no other direction. It had arrived at the dead letter office in the normal course of things, because the Post Office, London, was not a deliverable address, and it had been opened in inventory and had been found to contain a drawing of a horse, very carefully rendered for a child's drawing, with 4 legs that were approximately the right length and a mane that was enthusiastically executed, and beneath it, in the same large hand, "This is your horse, from William." Edmund had sat with this for a considerable time. He had then written back to the address 2 streets away, which appeared to be a newsagent's, and which he assumed William had arranged to use as a delivery point. He had said that the horse was very well drawn. He had said that he would keep it on his desk. He had said that he hoped the stockings for William's mother had arrived by some means. He put the drawing in the top left corner of his desk under the pen tray. It was still there. The Sheffield letter stayed in the drawer for 3 weeks. He took it out 3 times during those 3 weeks. Once in the first week, once in the second, once at the beginning of the third, and read it through and put it back. He was not procrastinating. He was waiting until he knew what he thought, because he had a rule about not writing until he knew what he thought. Because writing before you knew what you thought was a way of thinking aloud that served the writer rather than the reader, and he had always written for the reader. What he thought at the end of the third week was this: that the question she had asked, "What did I do wrong? What did I fail to see?" was not answerable by him or by anyone who had not been present in the 11 years she described, and that attempting to answer it would be a form of presumption that would not help her. What could be said was something different and smaller, that the question was reasonable, that the asking of it was not a failure, that letters sent to my husband, wherever he is now, arrived at the dead letter office in the same manner as all other letters and were read with the same care, and that she had been heard. He wrote her a page and a half. He read it 3 times before he sealed it. He paid the postage and put it in his coat pocket on a Thursday morning, and on his way out at the end of the day, he posted it at the box in St. Martin's-le-Grand. He had come to the dead letter office in October of 1858. He had been 28 years old. He had been working in the postal service since he was 19, first in a sorting office in Islington, then in the district office in Holborn. Then, after 2 examinations and an interview that had seemed to him both very long and very short, here, he had been told, when he was appointed, that the dead letter office was considered a specialized posting, and that the work was precise and exacting, and that most men found it either entirely suited to their temperament or entirely unsuited, and that there was rarely a middle ground. He had found it entirely suited. The room had been different then in its details, different gas fittings, a different sorting system, the same 3 oak tables, but refinished, and different in the particular way that new wood is different from old, and the same in everything that mattered, the same north windows, the same pigeonholes, the same smell of paper and old ink, the same morning quiet before the sacks arrived. He had been given a desk, not the corner desk. That had belonged then to the senior clerk, a man named Partridge, who had spent 30 years in the office, and who had the particular efficiency of a man who has done a thing for long enough that he and the thing have become indistinguishable. Edmund had sat at a table for his first 7 years. He had watched Partridge from the table and learned the work. The first letter he answered had been in December of 1858, his 3rd month in the office. It had been addressed to Mrs. Catherine Fellows, lately of the above address, the above address being a house in Paddington that had been demolished 3 years prior to make way for the railway extension, and the sender having apparently not received this news. The letter was from a woman who signed herself "Your loving sister Alice," and who wrote from Edinburgh, and who had been writing, It transpired from the contents, approximately once a quarter, since Catherine Fellows had last written back, which appeared to have been in 1854. Edmund had set it aside. This was not the procedure. The procedure was to inventory and categorize and move to the next item. But he had set it aside because he could not immediately determine the category, and he needed to think about it. And thinking about it at the table with the other clerks around him was not possible. He had thought about it all afternoon. At 5, when the office had emptied, he had sat at the table with the letter and a piece of paper, and he had written to Alice in Edinburgh. He had said what he knew, that the house at the address had been demolished, that the address was not deliverable, that the office had no record of a forwarding address for the former occupant. He had said that he was sorry to be the bearer of uncertain news, and that he hoped she would be able to locate her sister through other inquiries. He had posted it at his own expense because he had not known how else to account for it. There was no budget category in the office's accounts for replies sent to the senders of letters already opened and inventoried. He had thought about how to account for it and had concluded that he could not officially, which meant it was his own. He had been 28 and had just been paid his quarterly salary, and the postage was sixpence, and he had given it without particular deliberation, because the alternative was to have read Alice in Edinburgh's letter and done nothing, which he had found he was not able to do. He had not told anyone about it at first. He had not told Partridge, who was the senior clerk and who would have been the appropriate person to tell, because he was not certain that what he had done was permitted and was not prepared to be told that it was not. He had not told the other clerks, who were unremarkable men with whom he had a collegial but not close relationship. He had done it once, and then again in February, when a letter arrived addressed to a school in Brighton that had closed in 1851 from a man who had been a pupil there in the 1840s and who had, it appeared, spent the intervening years composing a letter of apology to a teacher he had wronged. The teacher was certainly dead. By 1859, the school was demolished. The man had spent years, apparently, working out what he wanted to say, and had said it to an address that no longer existed. Edmund had written back to him in Brighton. He had said that the office had received the letter, that the school had been closed for some years, that the teacher whose name appeared in the letter was not known to be reachable at the address. He had said that the letter had been read with attention, and that whatever the man had needed to say appeared to have been said clearly. The man from Brighton had written back. His letter had arrived through the regular post, addressed to E. Fitch at the GPO. Edmund had been the one to sort it, which was fortunate. It said only, "Thank you. That was what I needed to know." He had told Partridge in 1862. By then, he had answered perhaps 30 letters over 4 years, and the habit was established enough that concealing it from the senior clerk seemed both impractical and slightly dishonest, neither of which suited his temperament. He had waited for a quiet Friday afternoon when the office was winding down and asked whether Partridge had a few minutes. Partridge had listened to the explanation with no particular expression on his face, which was Partridge's default, and when Edmund had finished, he had said, "At your own expense." "Yes," said Edmund. and on your own time. You don't reply in office hours. No. And you only write to those you can identify. You don't pursue the ones with no return address. Not usually. There are exceptions. Partridge had considered. He had been in the office for more than 30 years by then, which was longer than Edmund's life at that point, and his silences had the weight of all of it behind them. "I've thought about it myself," he said finally. "Never did it." He paused. "I'll note it in the log as authorized incidental correspondence." Edmund had not expected this. "It keeps the work honest," Partridge said, which was the closest he ever came, Edmund had always thought, to explaining himself. He had received one letter that had troubled him for a long time, longer than any it had arrived in 1871, when he was 41 and had been at the office for 13 years. It was addressed to Edmund Fitch, if he is still there. The Dead Letter Office, London. No other direction. No street or district or postcode beyond that, which was either very good knowledge of the office's address or very good luck, and which had resulted in the letter arriving at the office in the ordinary morning sack rather than being returned, because the address, while unconventional, was technically sufficient. He had opened it in inventory, as he opened all letters, and had found 3 pages of close handwriting from a woman who knew his name, who had received, she said, a reply from him some years ago. She thought 1865 or 1866, she was not certain. In response to a letter she had written to her mother, who had died before receiving it. She had kept Edmund's reply for the intervening years and had thought about writing back and had not known what to say and had finally said all of it, that the reply had been the right thing, that she had needed it, that she hoped he was well, that she thought what he did was something that deserved to be known, and that she had not known how to say this for several years, but had decided finally that she should say it. He had sat with that letter for a very long time. He had not replied. She had not given her address. The letter was addressed to him and contained nothing returnable. He had placed it in his private drawer, where it had remained. Partridge had retired in 1870 and died in 1872, which Edmund learned from a notice in the Gazette. He had gone to the funeral, which had been a small and well-conducted affair in Hammersmith, attended by Partridge's sister and 2 nieces and several men from the postal service who had all, Edmund noticed, the particular upright quality of people accustomed to working with documents. He had not spoken at the funeral because he had not been asked, and because he would not have known what to say that would have been appropriate to the occasion. What he would have said, what Partridge told him, in the only words that had mattered, was already said and did not need repeating in a church in Hammersmith. He had taken the corner desk after Partridge's retirement. This had seemed the right thing, because someone had to take it, and he was the senior clerk, and the corner desk was the senior clerk's desk. He had not changed its arrangement. He had added his own drawer to it the second year to accommodate the letters. He thought about Partridge occasionally, not often, not with any particular feeling, only with the clarity that you think about someone who showed you something important. The note in the log, authorized incidental correspondence. The silence that had followed, the patience of a man who had spent 30 years with letters and had understood better than he perhaps knew what Edmund was trying to do. There had been a letter in 1869 that he had been wrong about. He had decided not to reply. It was one of the 4 times he had broken his rule about letters not meant to be received, and one of the 4 times he had been wrong to break it. The letter was from a woman in Manchester, addressed to her son, who had died in 1867. The address was the son's last address, which no longer held anyone who knew him. The letter was a mother's letter to a dead child. 2 years after the death, still writing, still reaching, Edmund had replied. He had said carefully that he had read her letter, that her son's address had been unoccupied since 1867, that he was sorry. He had said that her letter had been received and read with care. Her reply to E. Fitch, GPO, which she had found to address from the letter she received, had arrived 2 weeks later. It said, in a hand that was not entirely steady, "I know he is dead. I am not writing to him because I think he will read it. I am writing to him because I need to write it. Please do not write to me again." He had kept that reply also in the private part of the drawer. He had not broken the rule in the same way again after that. He had amended the rule to be more precise. Letters not meant to be received was not the same as letters not expected to be received. The distinction required more care than he had given it. The years had made him more patient, not less. He had not expected this. He had thought, in his early years, that patience was a fixed quantity, that one either had it or didn't, that it might be trained but not increased. He had discovered, gradually and without drama, that patience in the work of the office was not a quantity, but a skill, and that, like all skills, it improved with practice. The practice was simply the years and the letters and the early mornings and the draws cycle. By his 40s, he had understood that patience with a letter was not the same as willingness to wait. It was, rather, the capacity to let a letter sit in the drawer until his thinking had caught up with what the letter required, which was sometimes a morning and sometimes 8 weeks. By his 50s, he had understood that the patience itself was a form of attention, that the letter in the drawer was not waiting but being held, and that holding required the same concentration as reading, only distributed across days rather than minutes. He had explained none of this to anyone, because it had not seemed explicable until he was in his 50s, and by then the explaining of it would have required a context that did not exist in the normal conversation of the office. The normal conversation of the office was about the work, the letters, the log, the categories, the procedures, the occasional administrative matter requiring attention. He had had this conversation, at various levels of detail, with every person who had worked in the room. He had had the other conversation, the one about the drawer and the patience and what the patience was, with no one until Arthur Blunt had arrived and begun, in his thorough, direct way, to ask questions that mapped its outline from the outside. Arthur Blunt had come closer than anyone else, over 6 years, to understanding it without explanation. This was the thing he appreciated most about Arthur Blunt. He had answered a letter in 1885 that he still thought about. It had been addressed to the novelist Charles Dickens at a publishing house in London, and had arrived 15 years after Dickens died, which suggested that its sender, a woman in Halifax, from the return address, had either not known of the death or had decided that death was not a sufficient reason to stop writing. The letter was about David Copperfield. It said, in 3 careful pages, what the novel had done for her at a specific point in her life, which had been, she explained, not an easy point. She thanked him for it. Edmund had thought about this one for a month. He had written back, as himself, explaining the situation, explaining that he had read her letter. He had said, because it was true, and because he thought it was the relevant truth, that letters of this kind were not unprecedented at the office, and that the things said in them were not lost simply because the intended recipient was not available. He had said that David Copperfield had also been important to him, which was true, and that he was glad it had been so to her. He had not said anything that was not true. He had not pretended to be Dickens or to speak for Dickens. He had simply said what was his to say. She had written back 4 months later to E. Fitch at the GPO. She said she had not expected a reply of any kind and that she was glad of one. She said she intended to write to the publishing house again, but this time to say something different. Arthur Blunt had asked him once why he did not speak about the practice. It was the kind of question Arthur Blunt asked, direct, without preamble, in the middle of a working morning, while sorting, without looking up from the table. He had been in the office 3 years by then, and had clearly been thinking about the question for some time. Edmund had considered, because speaking about it would change what it is, he said. How? If the letters I answer are known to the senders, known to others, then they become a service, a thing people expect, a different kind of work. And what are they now? Edmund had thought about this carefully because it was the kind of question he did not often allow himself directly. They are correspondence, he said, between the office and the letters it receives, private correspondence. Arthur Blunt had sorted for a while. Between you and the letters, he said. Yes, said Edmund. This was more accurate than what he had said first, and he had found it slightly uncomfortable for exactly that reason. He had taken to letters early. He had always been a person who found letters more reliable than speech, more exact, more honest in the specific way that writing is honest when you cannot see the face of the person you are writing to, and cannot be influenced by what the face expects. The letters he answered were the letters he had been, in some sense, answering all his life. He had counted in the ledger the letters to the dead. This was a subcategory he had begun to track in 1880. Letters addressed to people who, according to the office's address records or the information in the letters themselves, had died before the letters arrived. There had been 37 of these from 1858 to 1893, or 29 if you counted only the ones whose addressees he could confirm as deceased from the records rather than inferring it from the content. He had replied to 11 of them. He had not replied to 18. The other 8 were in a category he had eventually labelled undetermined, meaning he had not been able to establish with sufficient certainty whether the intended recipient was alive or dead, only that the address was unreachable and the letter had returned. The ones he had replied to were the ones where the letter's sender was clearly unaware of the death, where the letter's content was ordinary, domestic, full of ordinary expectation, and the death was information that the sender apparently did not have. These he had replied to because there was something practical to convey, something that would eventually need to be known. The ones he had not replied to were the ones like the Manchester mothers, where the sender knew and was writing anyway, and where a reply from a stranger would have been an intrusion rather than a response. The line between these categories was not always clear. He had been wrong about where it was, occasionally. He had been right more often than wrong. The winter of 1893 had brought a particular letter he had not expected. It had arrived not in the sacks, but in the regular morning post, addressed to the clerk who answers at the Dead Letter Office, London. No name. The address was imprecise but sufficient. It had been delivered by the regular post and sorted by one of the junior clerks, who had placed it on Edmund's desk without comment, either because he understood it was for Edmund specifically, or because he did not know what else to do with it. Edmund had opened it at 10, after the morning's inventory was done. It was from a woman in York. She said she had received, in 1876, a letter from someone at the Dead Letter Office in response to a letter of her own, and that she had kept the reply for 17 years and had occasionally wondered about the person who wrote it. She said she had not known what to do with the wondering and had eventually decided to write, which was what she generally did when she did not know what to do. She said she hoped this reached the right person and that she was well, and that the matter that had prompted her original letter, which had concerned her husband's whereabouts, had resolved itself in due course, quietly and not entirely happily, but resolved. She said she wanted him to know this if he was the same person. She thought he might want to know. He had sat with this letter for the rest of the morning. He wrote back to York. He confirmed, yes, he was the same person, and had been at the office since 1858, and was glad the letter had found its way to him. He said he was glad to know the matter had resolved, and that resolution, even incomplete resolution, was something. He said he thought of the letters he had answered occasionally over the years, and that he had not generally known what happened after. He said, and this was more than he usually said, more than his rule about writing within limits, but he said it anyway, because it was true, and because it seemed right to say it to this particular person who had been wondering for 17 years and had finally written, that the letters he answered were, for him, not only correspondence sent outward, but a form of listening, that the work of the office was the work of last resort, and that what he added to it in his own time was a form of listening that last resort required, and that the ordinary procedures of the postal service did not provide. He said this carefully, aware that he was saying something he had not said before, at least not in this form, to anyone, including himself. He read the letter twice before he sealed it. He posted it on his way to the underground. Arthur Blunt found him at the drawer one morning in February, not looking through it, only sitting, the drawer open, his hands on the desk on either side of it, looking at the letters inside without taking any of them out. It was an unusual posture, neither the early morning writing nor the mid-morning reading, only sitting with the drawer open. Arthur Blunt set down the sack he had been carrying and looked at him. "Are you all right?" he said. Edmund looked up. "Yes," he said. "I was thinking." "About which one?" "All of them," said Edmund. Arthur Blunt considered this. He had been at the office long enough to have some sense of what all of them meant in this context. The 360 letters answered, the years before the ledger's count, the draw's accumulated cycle of in and out and in again. "Do you ever think about stopping?" he said. Edmund looked at the drawer. The question was not unkind. It was the kind of question Arthur Blunt asked because he was curious and direct and had decided that 6 years gave him some standing to ask it. "I think about what it would mean to stop," Edmund said. "I haven't decided that it would mean something good." Arthur Blunt nodded. He picked up the sack. He went back to the table. Edmund closed the drawer. He went to the table also. On a Thursday in February of 1893, the last letter of the afternoon was from a child. Not William, a different child, a girl, from the handwriting, addressed to my grandmother, in heaven, please. The postmark was Bermondsey. The envelope had been properly stamped, which meant someone had helped her post it, and the address, or the approximation that stood for one, had been attempted in a child's hand that was steadier than William's, but similarly large. The please was underlined twice. He opened it in the inventory at the end of the afternoon when the other clerks had moved to the table for the final sorting, and he was at his desk with the last items. She had written to ask whether her grandmother had arrived safely. She said she had been told her grandmother had gone to heaven in October, and she wanted to know if it was nice there, and if her grandmother had her blue shawl, which she had been wearing when she went, and if she was not too cold. She said she was Margaret, and she was 7. She said she would be in the garden on Saturdays if her grandmother wanted to visit, in case heaven was close enough. Edmund sat with this for a long time. He put on his coat at 5:30. He put the letter from Margaret in Bermondsey into his drawer, which was full. He would need to go through the drawer this week. Some of the older ones were past the 30 days, and he was keeping them past their time. He put his coat on and buttoned it. He put his hat on. He said good night to Arthur Blunt, who was still at the table finishing the day's log with the junior clerk. He went down the main staircase of the General Post Office and out through the entrance hall into the February evening, which was cold and damp and smelled of the city in the way the city smelled in February. Coal smoke and the particular cold of Thames-adjacent air. The smell of streets that have been wet since October and have not had the chance to dry. The entrance hall behind him was still busy at this hour, with the evening's post coming in. The counter clerks working the last of the day's business. He had worked in that hall briefly in his second year at the postal service before the Holborn posting, and he still felt, going through it each morning and evening, the particular sensation of passing through a place he had occupied at a different age, the mild vertigo of being, briefly, 2 times at once. He walked towards St. Paul's. He was thinking about Margaret in Bermondsey. He was thinking about what he could honestly say to a 7-year-old who had written to ask whether her grandmother had arrived safely in heaven and whether the grandmother had her blue shawl. There was very little he could honestly say. He could say the letter had been received, He could say it had been read with care. He could say, and this was the closest to the truth he was likely to get, that he did not have direct knowledge of the destination, but that the letter had arrived at the office in good order and had found a reader. He was not sure this was sufficient. He walked for a while thinking about whether it was sufficient. He decided, by the time he reached the underground, that sufficient was not the right measure and had never been the right measure for this particular kind of letter. What Margaret in Bermondsey had sent to heaven was not a letter looking for sufficiency. She had not needed her grandmother's location confirmed or her well-being established on the evidence. She had needed to ask, which was the most basic thing a letter could do, and what he could offer in reply was not sufficiency, but presence, that someone had been on the receiving end of the asking and had stayed there, had not put the letter in its category and moved to the next, had read the question about the blue shawl and held it for what it was. He would write what was his to write, and it would be what it was. He wrote to Margaret in Bermondsey the following morning, in the half-hour before the sacks arrived. He wrote as himself, as always. He said his name was Edmund Fitch, and he was a clerk at the General Post Office, and her letter had come to him because letters that could not be delivered were brought to his office, and that he had read it very carefully. He said that he could not speak with certainty about heaven, as it fell outside the area his office covered, but that her grandmother's letter had arrived in good order and had clearly been written by someone who loved her grandmother very much, and that this was noted. He said that the blue shawl was mentioned in her letter and would be remembered. He said that waiting in the garden on Saturdays seemed like a good arrangement, as gardens in winter were best attended to on a regular basis. He said he hoped she was well, and that he was glad she had written, because letters like hers were the reason the office kept its doors open every morning. He read it once. He was about to read it again, and then he decided it was right as it was and sealed it. He addressed it to Margaret, care of the Bermondsey address on the envelope. He put it in his coat pocket. He heard the sacks arriving on the stairs. He went to the table. Morning. He posted the Bermondsey letter at the box in St. Martin's-le-Grand at the end of the. Then he walked back up the steps and through the entrance hall of the General Post Office and up the stairs to the dead letter office, which was at its busiest mid-morning hour, and he hung his coat on the hook and sat at his desk and looked at the drawer. He opened it. The letters inside, perhaps 40 in various stages of his consideration, looked the same as they always did. The drawer had always contained approximately this number, varying between 30 and 50, depending on the season and the particular quantity of the week's sacks. In summer, fewer letters came with the kind of weight that he put in the drawer. In winter, more. January and February had always been the fullest months. He looked at them. He thought about Partridge, who had thought about it and never done it. He thought about the Brighton man, whose reply had been the first one that came back. He thought about the Manchester mother, who had told him clearly what he had misunderstood. He thought about the woman from York, who had wondered for 17 years and then written. He thought about William, whose horse was under the pen tray. He closed the drawer. He picked up the pen. He pulled the morning's inventory towards him and began to work. At 4 in the afternoon, when the sorting was done and the log was entered and the junior clerks were covering the tables for the night, Edmund reached into the left sack, the held letters, the ones with no action possible, and took out the last remaining item. It was a letter addressed to no one. The envelope was blank on the outside. No direction at all. Only the stamp, properly affixed, as though whoever had posted it had stamped it and addressed the outside only, internally, only to whatever they intended. It had been found, apparently, in a posting box in Kensington, undirected, returned here as required. No postmark on the direction, because there was no direction to postmark. He opened it. It was a single page. It said, in full, "I have not been able to say this to anyone, and so I am saying it this way, to no one, which is perhaps the same thing. I am not as unhappy as I was last year. I wanted to write it down somewhere so that it would be true somewhere." No name, no date, no address. He sat with it for a long time. Outside the windows, the February afternoon was going dark. The last clerks were putting on their coats. He put the letter in his drawer. He did not write a reply to the blank letter. He thought about it on the train home and on the walk from the station to his rooms, and while he was making his supper, which was a straightforward affair that he made with the attention of a man who has lived alone for a long time and who has learned to be present in small tasks as a way of being present in the evening. He thought about it while he ate, and while he read, and while he sat for a while, doing nothing in particular in the chair by the small fire, which was what he did when the thinking had not resolved and needed more time. He did not write a reply because there was no address to reply to, and because the letter had been sent to no one, and writing to no one was the letter's own practice, not his. What the sender had needed was a place for the thing to go, a posting box, a stamp, an address they had decided not to write. What they had got was the dead letter office, which was, he thought, not a bad place for it. He thought, it will be true somewhere. He thought, yes. In the morning, he would put it with the held letters, and it would be kept for its 30 days, and then it would go where the held letters went, which was not quite anywhere, but was not quite nowhere either. And this seemed sufficient to him, as things went, as endings went. He had spent 35 years in the work of last resort, and he had found that sufficient was, most of the time, the right measure. He banked the fire with the small iron poker he had kept since the rooms in Islington, which was before these rooms, and before the corner desk, and before Partridge, and before most of what had come to constitute his life at the office. The poker was the oldest thing he owned that was still in daily use. He had not thought of this before, as a distinction worth noting, but he thought of it now, banking the fire on a February evening, and found that it was a distinction worth noting after all. He banked the fire. He went to bed. In the morning, he would come in at 6:30, and the room would be empty and quiet, and he would open the drawer and take out whichever letter was ready, and he would write what was his to write, and then the sacks would arrive, and the day would begin. And that was what the work was, and that was what he was. And it had been enough for a long time, and he expected it to be enough tomorrow.